While there are just a few of us, though, I'll introduce myself, but I would love to have just know people's preferred names. And if you want to share personal pronouns, that would be wonderful, but no pressure to do that. The other thing I would love to know is just where you're coming from in terms of role. So if you want to share anything else, that's fine, but whether you work mostly in like the teacher education space, whether you're coming from like a research, more of a research space, a combination, whether you're a practicing teacher, just so I can have a little bit of like context for where people are. If you can follow Sarah's model and put that in the chat, that would be perfect. My name is Esther Enright, and unfortunately, my co-presenter, William Toledo, couldn't be here today in person, but we've found ways through technology and the wonders of technology to integrate him into the workshop today. We're going to run this, and I'm going to speak in we because he and I planned it together, and he will be participating, albeit remotely because of a family emergency. We are going to present this as a more interactive stop and go, engaging with the framework. I think that whenever we engage with something that's more abstract, like a theory or framework or something of the like, that we learn best through engaging with it and using it and taking it up and asking questions about it. And so I'm going to try to do that. If at any time you have a question or you'd like me to repeat something or interject or anything of the like, feel free to use the reactions, put up a hand, or you can send me a message in chat. I'll try to monitor both. I've gotten pretty good at it over the past 16 months. I'm sure all of us have. Or have gone on a lot of practice. My personal pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I do also want to acknowledge that I'm at Boise State University, which is in Boise, Idaho. I'm an assistant professor here, but as part of the university that is resting on the historical lands of the Boise Valley peoples, the elders past and present, and acknowledge and respect their wisdom and their claim over this land. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my PowerPoint, but it's not really meant to be a presentation style PowerPoint. It's really meant to help guide us through the work. So at any time, if you have any questions or you need to stop me, feel free. Anything up until now? Fantastic. Thank you all. So today we're going to be considering this idea of the public good, or the ideas of the public good, to be more specific. And what I want us to think about, is this approach that William Toledo, who I will call Will because he's my friend and colleague, at the University of Nevada, Reno, started thinking about, called civic perspective taking, approximately 5 to 6 years ago now. And we've been doing active research in mostly second and third grade social studies in the United States since then, out west in the Western states. And civic perspective taking is going to be one of the focuses of our work today, and understanding what we mean as a framework and what the different elements are, and then how we can use it to better support pre-service as well as practicing teachers, and what potential extensions there are in our own work as researchers and educators. And I'm going to allow Will, since he really started and generated the thinking around civic perspective taking, as opposed to historical and other types of perspective taking. I'm going to allow him to, through our video, really start presenting this concept. And so if you give me a little forbearance, I'm going to shift over and share. And this is also in our folders as well. Just give me a thumbs up if you can see the black screen. Great. So I'm going to put my volume all the way up, and it might be helpful since it's a video if you can as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share with you our civic perspective taking framework so that you can get an understanding of the entire framework a little bit more in depth before we walk you through the specific component that we focused on in this study. So our framework is presented here on screen for you, and it's a 7-component framework. Each component that is presented is something that we found across 3 different years of research as we collected work samples from different school sites and engaged in research with teachers to design and implement curricular units in different contexts. We conducted this research in Title I schools in urban districts in the state of New Mexico. We conducted this research in Title I and more affluent schools in urban and rural areas in Nevada. And we are continuing to study these components across grade levels. So we begin with second graders, second grade being the first age where students were really able to conceptualize and consider perspectives outside of their own from a psychological and cognitive development perspective. And now we're getting into the territory where we're looking at 3rd and 4th graders. This research that we're sharing with you today is all from 3rd grade classrooms, and it's all from that period of time from January 2020 through March 2020 that we remember so well, where COVID-19, or the coronavirus as it was known at the time, was really something that seemed far off and got closer and closer to our communities. Within this framework, we have different pieces that are essential for students to engage in civic perspective taking. One being able to differentiate between facts and opinions and understand the characteristics of each, being able to support their own opinions and opinions outside of their own with reasons, being able to write in the persuasive or argumentative genre, differentiating between public and personal issues to understand what issues impact greater communities like neighborhoods, cities, states, countries, or even the world. A lot of the 3rd grade standards focus on global conceptualizations of civics. Considering the common or public good, which is the one that we're going to focus on today, engaging in civic perspective taking with peers, which could mean impromptu, informal discussions or more formal protocols that they engaged in as they discussed public issues, and using academic vocabulary. So words like public issue, words like civics, words like common or public good. As I said, today we're really going to focus on how students conceptualized or considered the common or public good during COVID-19. How did they think about the coronavirus, as it was known at the time, in terms of their own communities? How did they think about it in terms of other communities? And what did this look like? How did this concept kind of shift and change even within our framework in this totally new and really abrupt and important context that was the start of the pandemic in the United States? So that is basically our framework that we are going to talk through with you today and work through with you. We're going to look at some student work samples and allow you the chance to analyze those alongside us and see what we were thinking as we saw this work come out in students' work.
So thank you to Will, who I'm glad could be here through that recording. What I want, first of all, to point to is that you can find more. We just published an article in Social Studies and the Young Learner, as well as Counselor, and you can find more information there, and I can make those citations available later for you. What I would really love to think about, though, is in a first step today, why might civic perspective taking as a constellation of skills be important to name, and how, like, and how does it afford us leverage when we're preparing pre-service teachers or doing professional development for practicing teachers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put you in pairs into groups, or you know what, since there's only 4 of you right now, why don't we just do it all together as a whole small group, and do away with the rooms. But I want us to think about, first of all, like, what leverage does this framework give us that the individual components might not give us on their own. And what I usually just do is I let people popcorn, and if 2 people start talking at once, just one person just steps back and speaks second. So we'll just do it more informally that way.
Well, I think if you're looking at, I won't say first, clockwise from differentiate fact and opinions, those first 3 on that side, they could definitely be devoid from social studies, one. But I think as you continue to go around that loop, you get into grander conversations of really thinking through issues that are involving more than you. And I was wondering, and I may have missed it, but could you maybe give just and you may be doing this later, so you can ignore the question if you are, but a specific example of what civic perspective taking looks like as you all were talking about it?
Yes, and that's a great segue that I'm going to use in a few minutes as well. But more directly, I think that for an easy access example, oftentimes we have conversations about content in social studies, or we work hard on skill building in social studies on the elementary level, or history or civics tends to be the content, but it's really a literacy lesson, right? It's really about English language arts. It's not really about the social studies content in the text. And so one of the things that this framework is doing that I think, Sarah, you were starting to point out was that it takes larger areas of skill building and knowledge building, such as using academic vocabulary or supporting opinions with reasons, which are things we work on across the elementary school curriculum, especially in 3rd grade. But what it does is it ties them to social studies content in meaningful ways where the content becomes highlighted and forefronted in our portrait. And it also ties it to a skill set, right? And so this is specifically not about argumentation or persuasion with the intent to persuade, but with the intent to understand other perspectives, which we see as a democratizing force in a classroom. Does anybody else want to add a couple observations? I'm trying to kind of get at some of what you're noticing. Christy's noticing, and she's having some internet difficulties, which I 100% identify with. Being over 100 degrees in Idaho, we keep losing power. She's saying that persuasive writing seems odd here to me, that there's something about the genre of persuasive writing that usually puts people in competition, is what I'm assuming Christy is pointing out. And what we actually want to think about in the persuasive, oh, Christy, can you? You're coming in and out a little bit. But what's interesting to us about the persuasive genre is that it's not always used to persuade, but it's used to present a persuasive it's used to persuasive arguments, but it's also a context in which we can learn how to understand one another's positions, stances, opinions, and the reasons for those opinions. So keep in mind, we're thinking about little bodies. We're thinking about first, second, third graders. And their developmental stances, their developmental places. Taking a stance is something that's new. And so the purpose of these constellation of elements together within this specific context of disciplinary literacy, which is this persuasive genre, is not actually to get students to persuade one another, but to get them to recognize the stances and the structure of persuasive arguments so that they can then learn to look at different arguments and the structures and understand them in order to formulate their own stance. And so I'm going to use what Christy and Sarah launched us with to then think about an example, which I'm going to shift into now. And these recordings are also on in your folder for the conference in case you want to refer back to them. Thank you to Charlie for that.
I'm going to share with you the first student work sample. This one is actually a verbal work sample. So this is a transcription of some classroom observation data. During this exercise, just to give you some context around where we were with COVID-19 at the time, this was around the time that we started to hear the news about how deadly COVID-19 was. This was before the time where we thought it would impact the United States, or before, the majority of news sources were reporting that. It was before we knew that it was transmitted through air vapors. It was before we knew a lot of the characteristics of the disease that we know. During an exercise, as this was a public issue and students were thinking about immigration and travel and that, the impact of these public issues on communities, students were asked to take a stance. This was a really purposeful framework in which students physically took a stance after some different exercises where they researched the issue, discussed the issue, got to consider their own stance. They would take a stance physically somewhere in the room, and then they would have the chance to kind of participate in a whole class discussion from their sides, and then that would lead to actually a realignment. So they would be able to consider other people's evidence and reasons, and they would be able to kind of readjust or realign based on new learning, which we think is a really important part of this framework. In this particular instance, we're seeing that a student, Jessica, in Miss Evans' class, moved to a specific side of the room. And I'm just going to read you this transcript and then talk through a little bit about what we were thinking with this. So Miss Evans, in this whole class discussion, once students are standing on their sides of the room, says to Jessica, "Now, Jessica, tell me, why did you move where you did?" And Jessica says, "Well, I say no travel because the sick people could come to our community and get everyone sick." Miss Evans says, "Okay, so Jessica believes we need to protect our community. What parts of our community are you thinking about?" And she says, "I think our school, our neighborhood, and the whole city." All of, and she says the city name. Jessica says yes. Miss Evans asks, "Can you use our new vocabulary to think about this? What about the common good?" So Jessica says yes. For the common good, I say no travel because the common good is our community being protected. So here we saw, in terms of that concept from our framework, considering the public or common good, that Jessica was conceptualizing the community at different levels.
At different levels. But I am going to pause Will here because I want us to look at this first before we hear a little bit more from Will about what we attended to in our research. But if you were looking at this, what elements what elements or components pop out at us to begin with that are interesting features of the instructional conversation? So what are we noticing that is an interesting feature for whatever reason about this instructional conversation?
Well, it's just between the teacher and one student. It's not student to student at all.
Right. So at this point, this is an interaction where the teacher is trying to get the student to articulate her thinking and to delve more deeply into her thinking. I think that's a really important element. So we're not seeing any student to student facilitated interaction yet.
I think you see some of the elements that you were speaking to about using academic language. She through some questioning, and the student went back and used the term common good, and then also kind of clarified her reason for choosing the position that she was taking.
So, and also to connect what, and I'm going to use first names just because that's what I'm seeing when I, when I look at it. I believe it was Carol who said that this is an interaction between the teacher and the student, right? And then the student, to connect with what Sarah's saying, the teacher prompts the student to use specific new vocabulary, right? But then the student uses and leverages that new vocabulary to further explain her idea and her stance. What else do we notice?
I think she also, through some of the prompting, defines who her community is. And so the teacher's, asking her, what does this mean, right? Because community can mean a lot of things. So she was kind of naming who all was in her community.
I'm seeing a lot of nodding about that too. So when we talk about community, community is one of those words, especially in civics instruction, that we kind of assume shared understanding, right? Or a single entity. And what's interesting about focusing on civic perspective taking and the different components, especially public good and community, is that students started defining community in the ways that they viewed community, but they weren't always in alignment with what the standards wanted students to see as community. So the social studies standards wanted students to stretch and see this view of global community and global citizenship, right? Because you can't have global citizenship without a sense of global community and collectiveness. And so what was really interesting about this was that students really had to stretch, students really had to stretch and start with what are types of communities that you see, and that is something that unfolded in these dialogues, as well as broader conversations when they expanded beyond the individual student. And yeah, as Dean is pointing out, Jessica knows she's part of multiple communities, right? So she's already understanding this multiplicity of membership, of belonging, which is really incredibly important if you're going to talk about things on a very local level, on a city level, a state level, on a national or a global level, to understand that you can belong to multiple publics at the same time. And so community here is really a proxy for understanding public and a scaffold for understanding the public good. And that, like, we can have multiple publics, we can have multiple public goods, and those are often in tension. And so I'm gonna let Will continue with some of his noticing about this original data set. And then he's going to bring us into a second sample, and I'm going to pause again so that we can look at the second sample, because it looks at these issues in a slightly different way.
So she thought about the school community, which was the smallest community that she referenced, the neighborhood community, which was slightly larger, and the whole city. So in this instance, Jessica was beginning to conceptualize smaller and larger communities, but she wasn't at that level where she was considering national or global communities and the impact of COVID-19 on those communities. So this would be a perfect work sample to show where a lot of students were in these third grade classrooms, that they were thinking about really their direct communities. And as we kind of did some post-study work and interviews with teachers and focus groups, we found teachers' perceptions were this was just based on their exposure for a lot of them. They hadn't traveled much outside of Nevada, or for some of them, even their cities. So this was kind of our indication that they were basing their leveled understandings of community and the size of community as they conceptualized the public or common good, based a lot on their own experiences. We saw, however, that other students really thought through this and began to think of this in a much more global way. So we're going to share another example. This is an example from Miss Torres's class, as students engaged in discussions on a separate public issue, but a public issue that was related to COVID-19. And as coronavirus was on the news so much, it was really something that came up in a lot of our discussions, whether it was intentionally included in a specific lesson in the curriculum or not. It really showed up in the classrooms. So in this sample, Ms. Torres and the class are discussing the central question, or the essential question: should we have screened immigrants for health? And this was actually an historical question, as they thought about Ellis Island and the screening processes for immigrants there. But of course, it got related a little bit, to today and what people were thinking. So students moved to a side of the room to represent their stance on this issue. And Ms. Torres acknowledged that most people fell on one side, that yes, we should have screened immigrants for health. And one student, JD, actually went to the side that says, no, we shouldn't have. And as JD is explaining his rationale, he says, it's selfish of the United States to not let people come here, even if they're sick. Why should they go back to their own country to get people there sick? And Alex says, yes, but if there's a bigger community, we are bigger. What if they are sending the sick people to the bigger community and getting more people sick instead of taking care of them? And JD says, but it's like the coronavirus here now. So here's where that current issue kind of meets that historical context. They don't want to be sick over there. They can come here. And Alex says, but we don't want to get sick here. Our community is the common good. And to us, this was a really perfect representation of kind of where the nation was, during, and the world during COVID-19, that we saw these.
So we saw certain things, but I do want to pause for a second and think about, again, what are the features of this interaction? And so you have students doing a position-taking activity. So they're taking a stance. These third graders are asked to stand on one side of a room versus the other side. And so there's a little bit of a duality here that's forced. And they're asked to take a stance about a historical issue about whether we should have screened immigrants for health-related illnesses at Ellis Island as a mechanism for rejecting some people's entry into the country. And so whether there should have been that level of screening that kept some people out and other people in because of health concerns. And so students moved predominantly to one side of the room, agreeing that these health screenings were important and they were in favor of them. And JD is the one student who hung out on the other side of the room. And so this is where this interaction is happening. And again, I'm going to bring up Carol's point that we're seeing an interaction mostly between Mrs. Torres and JD, but also Alex is coming in and presenting their stance from this pro screening stance that they took. So I want to take a moment and notice again, what features do we have here in this growing discussion?
feel like there's more, I don't know if it's necessarily, well, it is intended, I guess, in terms of the way that the classroom activity was structured, but definitely more persuasion. And I think through some of the questioning, seeing students try to structure that and support where they are in this. I also think kind of, this isn't happening here, but my mind is kind of thinking about where you talked about differentiating public and personal issues, and how is there conflation here between where Alex is saying our community is the common good, and how, you know, when is the common good our personal issue, is it public, and kind of thinking about how you would pull that out with students.
And I think noticing also that Alex's language around using that new vocabulary is clumsy, right? It's not as fluid or fluent as we saw in the other clip, but that's also really good formative assessment data for the teacher, right? So that's something that the teacher will need to take up and think about. So Alex might be saying that their community is equivalent to the common good, right? In which case, that there's a real misconception there. Or our community is the public I'm framing the common good around, and the language itself is messy, right? And so Alex might be taking a stance, and they might be making a claim there that according to their definition, the community that they're in right now is how they're defining the common good. So their health and welfare would be that basis, right? Where JD is thinking about different communities' goods, right? And defining that on a different level and understanding the multiplicity of that. And so coming out of like this conversation, there's a lot of rich formative assessment data here. What's another thing that we're noticing that's happening in this conversation? And anyone who feels more comfortable putting it in chat and having me voice it is completely fine doing that. Oh, I forgot to, Sarah, the first thing you said was something about the structure. And I do want to elevate that too, is the structure of it is meant traditionally to persuade and to argue. But the teacher actually, through her questions here, is trying to use the structure to get them to see different perspectives, right? And so she's asking JD why they feel the way they feel, not for reasons to persuade someone else. So like to attend to the structure of the questions too is really important, because oftentimes we take debate style structures in their original purpose and construction, but the teacher is actually shifting that as a platform or a text, as persuasion as almost a genre of text, so that students can then start looking at each other's perspectives and understand the reasons for their opinions and stances, as well as expand upon them. Other questions or noticing? I know it's late on the East Coast. People are getting hungry. Okay, so one other feature that I'm going to let Will bring up is the connection between the historical context of Ellis Island and this contemporary context, and how the students bring forward the connection.
Different understandings of community and these microcosms of thought that were really related to people's understanding or different understandings of the common good and the public good, and how those varied. So here we saw that JD was really thinking about community on a much more global scale. He was thinking about community in a way that encompassed not just a singular nation or entity, but the entire world, and thinking about people's circumstances. For instance, when he said, what if, why should people go back to their own country to get those people sick? So he was thinking about things that a lot of the students in these classrooms weren't. And we found this really interesting because it shows how even very young children are capable of conceptualizing the public or common good at these different levels that are so, you know, if you think about a third grader, it's very impressive to us and our research team that students, even any students, were able to conceptualize the common good on these levels that considered global ramifications and the impact on people in nations and in places that they had never been, visited, or possibly even been exposed to. So we felt like these two work samples, both from a stance-taking framework, kind of showed how students thought about this. The majority of our students really conceptualized this on a local level or a national level, but we had these students like JD who did conceptualize the common good on this global level, which speaks to the importance of really bringing in global content and helping students extend that civic perspective taking beyond even their direct communities to these larger communities because they're capable of it. And it really makes the conversations more complex and important in ways that we really hadn't seen before.
Okay, so we're going to say goodbye to Will. I'm going to bring us back to how this thought changed our thinking. Oops.
I'm going to share
how this changed our thinking about civic perspective taking. And then I'm going to open it up for us to have a more open discussion about it. But we noticed that students were doing 3 things in the unit that we hadn't planned for. And those 3 things actually added complexity and depth and richness to civic perspective taking and pushed it more into that space of a framework for thinking about unit planning. And one of those was making connections between public issues. So this idea that they had learned something before or learned something in a different space, and they were starting to connect across issues. So rather than focusing on the issue in front of them, they were making connections between historical issues and contemporary ones, different contemporary issues, sometimes pointing out how the public good, even in the same space, in the same consumption of public and community, could be different for different issues, right? And so, for example, we were thinking about taxes in the 3rd grade and how taxes locally help pay for the schools and pay for different things. But then they're also thinking about how the increase in taxes was leading to increases in housing insecurity, which many of these students were experiencing themselves. And so the rise in taxes also leading to the rise in local rent. And there was an entire lesson exploring, well, you know, even in looking at a single issue, it might feel fairly clear to them what their stance is on the public good. When they put 2 issues next to each other, that those stances then become a lot more complicated. And helping young children make peace with complicated structures and complicated stances, and being able to articulate them and give their reasons for those stances, but also think about how other people have complicated stances, and it could be because they have different lived experience and different reasons, and to learn how to respect that. So these making connections across public issues really added complexity and depth to civic perspective taking activities. We also found that they were considering implications of a public issue on their own community. And so they, even though a lot of the standards were pushing them to think more globally and to think in wider, broader more abstract sizes and scopes, they were still bringing it back to their own local communities. And so they were learning how to do that multiplicity, but they were also becoming more fluid and moving back and forth and thinking about the difference between global and local influences. And then the third thing is they were also envisioning next steps for engaging with people on the public issue. So thinking about possible solutions was something that was built into the unit, but how to take up those possible solutions was not. And that was something that started popping up is, well, we should write a letter, or we should talk to the school board about this, or we should do this, or we should do that. And so they were thinking about how to engage with others and others who had different stances than they might have around this public issue. And so that led to us rethinking what these different components are. And so this is a living structure. And given that it's a living structure, I'd like to now open it up and think about what places are there pushback, how might this be different in early childhood education than it is in early elementary and late elementary, or even in a secondary space, or for our pre-service teachers. So just opening up in general and thinking about what might we take away from this back into our own roles and work. And Dean, I appreciate that you brought a guest to the conference. I have 2 of them here that you can't see.
I think one question I have, and this always becomes more challenging when thinking about talking about this in developmentally appropriate ways. But as you're thinking about connections between public issues, community implications, and even what public good means, where's, like, thinking about where is power in this and how does that become part of the conversation? Because we could have different stances, right, on public issues that are side by side, but one may be about me continuing to have my privilege and the other may be about stripping away your humanity, and those aren't the same. And so like thinking through how does that fit into this, if this is a framework that's going to teachers, like how are they thinking through that those kind of underlying questions?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Charlie and I were actually talking about that when we both first logged in to the session. We were setting up because Idaho was one of the first states to pass a law against teaching critical race theory, and it was passed in K-12 as well as in post-secondary education. So we are no longer allowed to explicitly teach in the state of Idaho where I'm located, legally allowed to do that. And I don't think it's going to hold up in court, but it's part of our context right now, right? And I think it's part of the larger issue, Sarah, that you're pointing to, which is how do we think about issues of power and structure and systematic organization in a way without telling students what to think, right? Either on a post-secondary level with our emerging social studies teachers, or in a K-12 early childhood education level with our students there. And there's no easy, like you said, it's a complicated question. There's no easy answer to it. Will and I are just actually resubmitted a final draft to Elementary School Journal addressing this and talking specifically about what it means then to take up a culturally sustaining pedagogical approach to civic perspective taking, and how civic perspective taking in and of itself, just like standards, can be used to advance purposes that we don't want, right? And so you could definitely use this to have students take incredibly monolithic, homogeneous, self-serving stances, right? For lack of a better term. But what we've noticed is if you come at teaching and designing the unit using culturally sustaining practices, which Paris and Alim wrote a book about in 2017 and have a whole host of articles, and really think about what does it mean to choose issues that are locally relevant, important to the community, that are connected to language and culture in ways that look at language and culture as assets. And then also think in complicated ways about these issues without enforcing the perspective of the educator in the room, because we don't know what that perspective is going to be either. And what we found when we looked at these different bodies of data in that way is that it really has to start with professional development, and that there's no way to infuse a framework and make it kind of bulletproof against that kind of misuse, and that it comes down to how teachers take up and engage with learning how to use these frameworks, right? And so Will and I both hold complicated racial identities. Neither of us are white. And in doing that work, I think that the stance that I think he would agree with me, the stance that we take is that even something as closely tied to multicultural education and critical race theory as culturally sustaining pedagogy or other forms of that, such as culturally relevant pedagogy or culturally responsive pedagogy with Geneva Gay's work and Gloria Ladson-Billings' work, that one of the really complicated aspects of that is the teachers need to be able to take ownership, take it up, and use it. And most of the teachers we work with tend to be white women from middle-class backgrounds. And that we need to find a way to look at these teachers with empowering asset-based lenses. And I think that a lot of the discourse around our teachers right now is actually very deficit-based. It comes out of a really misunderstood understanding of critical whiteness, and it doesn't help. But by creating structures where teachers can come together with researchers, like we did in this study, and develop these units together, where teachers are positioned through their multiple identities and intersecting identities as having expertise, but also as having spaces where they need to lean into their humility, and recognizing their own power in choosing and framing topics, and then creating spaces where they can also lend that power to students in the classroom, so students can then choose and make connections and then start making their own spaces in the curriculum, and reclaiming these connections for themselves is really important. And Christy is making a really interesting point in chat, which I think is implicit in what I'm saying, but it should be explicitly stated, and it's important that you're pushing on it, is this like one-off or spray and pray professional development doesn't get at that. And so what we really need to do is think about professional development as more of a collaborative space, right? As a collaboration on the district level, between researchers and subject coaches, between teachers, but teachers need to come to the table as more than the empty recipients of the knowledge. So that they have a process of empowerment, and so they also can experience that, so that they can create that situation for their students as well. Does that?
It's
Yeah.
collaboration, but it's also sustained engagement. That's one of the other flaws of most professional development. It's like, hello, goodbye, good luck.
Right. And a lot of these, what Christy's calling spray and pray, I call one-off, or even some of the softer models of professional development, like the reading circles. They're important, but if you're not reading to do and apply and to struggle and to talk, there's really, it doesn't, the research at least says it doesn't sink into your practice in any way that's sustainable, right? And so if we think about this in methods courses, students need to not just be talking about and reading about these ideas, they need to actually be taking up and engaging with them. So I just also want to make sure that we pause and let other people also look at the chat so that we can make sure that everyone has a chance to share. But research used to be, Christy's saying research used to be 90% of professional development doesn't stick or go anywhere without follow-up. And that's for simple how-to instructional strategies, right? So how to ask more open-ended questions, which is complicated work, but is more straightforward than anti-racist pedagogy, which is very true. But I think that there is, at least with my master's students, and I also do superintendent preparation in the state of Idaho, which is interesting. But what I notice is that students are starved for this. They want it. I mean, K-12 students, early ed students are even really engaged with it, but like our post-secondary master's and undergraduate students want spaces to talk about this work without shame and without threat. And those threats can be really real. And Dean, you're bringing up, especially when professional development doesn't match the culture of the school or the teacher's perceptions of regulation. I think something that adds even more complexity to what you're saying is that we conflate in schools evaluation and formative feedback through supervision too, right? And so when someone comes into your room to watch you teach, then are they evaluating you or are they helping you translate what you learned in a professional development lens? And so we got around that by using university-based researchers instead of the district-based researchers, even though they were part of this project, to go into the classrooms and to help teachers make sense of how they're implementing and where they might push more. But because we had no evaluation context, it helped kind of remove the teeth and the threat from that work, right? Although there's always an element of like, am I being judged? Right? It's a hard thing to experience. So in the last few minutes, I do want to make sure that I'm leaving you with three kind of major takeaways from the civic perspective taking. And this comes as we were bringing up from both the culturally sustaining pedagogy approach as well as civic perspective taking, but keeping it current, keeping it local, and keeping it connected. Right. And so keeping it current can be anything that's happening that in the public space that is important to students. Keeping it local is connected to that. So this idea of criminalizing homelessness was really big in Nevada at the time. And how do you then bring that in and translate that into age-appropriate content? And then keeping it connected. So actually planning for thematic, geographic, chronological, as well as social justice-based connections that students can make. And then the last thing I want to leave you with is our contact information. Feel free to reach out. Both of us teach social studies methods. I focus on higher education and teacher education and how we can create and support a more diverse teaching force. And Will focuses in a lot on civics instruction in particular in elementary schools and how we can create more space within civic education, within elementary education for civic education. And so we invite you to head out and connect to others and to reach back and think about us. And thank you so much for engaging and participating.
Esther, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Terrific, very thought-provoking, richly embedded in the research, and that only enhances the quality of our conferences. So we really appreciate that, and we'll see you in future sessions and maybe even on tour this evening.
Yes, with cocktails, I hear.
There you go. All right, thanks a lot, everybody. We'll see y'all later.
Bye, all. Thank you for participating.